Hi, I'm Ethan, I love muzzleloading, and this is a Waters, Gill & Company Flintlock brass-barreled blunderbuss with an underslung bayonet and self-priming pan. John Waters was granted British patent number 1284 in 1781 for a sprung bayonet mechanism on pistols and is credited with inventing the snap bayonet found on many blunderbusses of the period. The barrel has Birmingham private proofs flanking John Waters' crown/IW maker's mark on the upper left of the breech. The barrel is a smooth bore 16 gauge barrel. The barrel measures 12 1/8 inches long and is octagon to round in profile. As interesting as the underslung spring-loaded bayonet is on this piece, it is fairly common in surviving blunderbusses for the 18th century. What's really interesting to me about this piece and what really caught my eye is the automatic pan priming system built into the lock here. When many of us think about the flintlock mechanism, we think of just our standard lock with our cock, our flint, our pan, and our frizzen, and our exterior frizzen spring. And in our heads, a lot of times the flintlock stays the same from its invention, gets a little bit smaller with age, and then is then made obsolete by the percussion cap. But what's interesting to me about the flintlock ignition period in firearms technology is we developed the flintlock as ignition system. It was the primary ignition system for 200 years, and it was being iterated on through that entire period. We have multiple generations coming into ownership of flintlocks and then trying to figure out how to make them better. And this right here is a prime example of trying to invent and advance upon the flintlock mechanism while staying with the tried and true for the time period ignition system. So from the side here, it's a pretty typical flintlock system. We have all the parts that you're going to be used to seeing. We even have our typical English safety lever back here at the back of the cock, because we don't have a set trigger on this piece. Even though we have two triggers on the underside, our rear trigger only controls the bayonet release mechanism. You can see here on the exterior of the lock, we have a fairly typical lock, as I said, but we have a very thick frizzen. On the front of our frizzen here, we actually have a powder flask or a powder cavity here for our priming powder or our charge powder, depending on what was being used for the time. Here at the top, we have a small door that caps off this small volume here for us to fill with priming powder. And you'll notice we have an arm linked coming off underneath our pan to this pivoting arm here on the side of the frizzen. This entire assembly here that this arm is linked to rotates, and it is connected to a small door on the inside of our cavity here underneath our frizzen. On a typical flintlock muzzleloader, this frizzen is going to be flat, and it's not going to have really anything special. It's just going to contain our ignition or our priming charge as the charge ignites. What happens with this lock when we take it back to half cock here, which I just want to note that this is still a very stout lock despite being a couple hundred years old here. When we go to close our frizzen like we would on any flintlock muzzleloader, you'll notice this arm here on the side of the frizzen rotates from a down to my left, we'll say here, position. And when that rotates, there's a small door that goes through the entirety of this frizzen that rotates and dumps a pre-measured priming charge into our pan. So when the pan is in this open position, powder flows from our cavity here into that small scooped out closure there or lid. And as the whole frizzen is closed, that rotates, dumps out our priming powder, and when that opens and dumps our priming powder into the pan, that same door keeps the rest of our volume here closed off from the ignition. So you're not going to have your priming charge ignite and then your entire priming cavity here ignite popping the lid open and giving you a little bit of a start. Now, I can't take this out to the range to test the practicality of this, and it could be argued that we don't see this very much in large-scale flintlock production outside of small numbers of military applications. So it could be argued that it didn't work as well as, you know, it seems like it would, but nevertheless, it's a really interesting concept to see on an original flintlock like this. I love seeing the iterative steps from the invention to when it was eventually obsoleted on any firearm technology. Flintlocks, I think, are just neat because we get to see such a large expanse of time from invention to obsolescence. And we have a lot of neat little side steps or little veins for us to go out into because of that long period of time. Jumping down now to our trigger guard, we have kind of the next interesting side of this. We've talked about these spring-loaded bayonet systems on other blunderbusses, but I'm going to go over it here as well because we do have a bit of a change from the others that we've looked at. So on first glance, it looks as if we have a set and a primary trigger on this muzzleloader, but our rear trigger is not a set trigger at all. It's actually just mechanically linked to our entire front of our trigger guard here, which is kind of masqueraded as the capturing mechanism for our bayonet, as you see back here. So taking it out of our stand here to show you, I'm going to hold on to the bayonet just so that it doesn't absolutely shoot out. But in a position where we've fired our main charge and we're in a melee situation, and this is the easiest thing that we have access to, we would depress this rear trigger. And when we do that, at the very front of our guard here, we have a door that is pulled back with our trigger in a 1-to-1 ratio. So there's not any stepping down or any linkages there, but it is just spring loaded to pull back enough to clear our bayonet to allow it to come forward. And then if I were to let this just open up with its spring, it would catch up here on this underlug underneath the barrel, and that when we would have our about 5.5 inch long bayonet here to give us a little bit of melee capability here. This is one of the shortest blunderbusses of this type that I have seen, but it is still just a really interesting piece for us. To then sheath the bayonet, we have a small gate or arm here at the front where our bayonet locks into that lug. We can depress the rear of that, and that allows our bayonet to come free. And then you can see here we have kind of a leaf spring underneath the barrel that we need to then overcome, depress our rear trigger to allow our bayonet to slide back in, and then our bayonet is sheathed. So as another example here, pretty neat. You know, again, kind of an added mechanical addition really that we don't think about a lot when it comes to flintlock muzzleloaders, but it's something that makes this a very interesting piece. In talking to a lot of contemporary makers, one of the notions that I hear a lot is to be a gunsmith, especially in the period, not necessarily exclusively to a contemporary sense, you have to understand and be capable of doing a variety of things. Now, a piece like this was most likely built in a shop that had employees where you could possibly have various specialties, where you would have somebody that did stock work or lock work or metal work or inletting and that kind of thing. But when it came to the design of things like this automatic priming pan and the spring-loaded bayonet system, you had people that were a little cagey. They like to tinker, they like to invent, and they like to develop this stuff. And I think that kind of spirit of ingenuity is really evident in the flintlock era and in the muzzleloading era in general, because things weren't necessarily as defined as they are today. And it just makes, I think it just makes that period really neat, because the changes and the advancements that we were trying to figure out are really evident and really obvious. You can't miss this when you look at the front of this frizzen and underneath this barrel. Apart from the lock mechanism, we just have a really standard English blunderbuss for the period. We have brass furniture. We have an octagon to round brass barrel with a slight bell towards the end. Coming back to our butt plate, we have some light engraving here on the top, just really fine English engraving, but it's not overdone. We just have some simple borders, some nick and dot borders, and then several carved lines in the butt plate. It's held on with 2 screws at the end, one at the top and one towards the tail or the toe of our butt plate. We just have some simple lines taking us from the ornate engraving up at the top crest of the butt plate down and back to the rear. We have a fairly plain walnut stock here. You'll notice we don't have any patch box on the side. We have a nice thinly pointed crest back here with some nice definition coming off of our wrist. We have a brass wrist extension here with some cast or engraving motifs here. It's not been personalized in any way like we see in other items. The frame here for some initials or a crest has been left plain. Coming up to the tang off of our wrist here, we have some simple carved lines coming off of our tang and a simple shell or beaver tail carving coming off of the point of the tang. This is a carving that we see a lot in the period. Regardless of where you're at, really, I think the English probably popularized it, but we also see it carried over into American arms and then post-Revolutionary War American arms for a time period. Our tang itself is iron or steel. The barrel is brass, but I think we have probably an iron tang and breech here for the added durability. There's some light border engraving on our tang with some scroll work coming off of our tang screw. Our tang screw has some engraving on it, kind of a floral flower motif here, but it's not necessarily to the quality of the rest of the engraving we see on the piece. There is some signs of wear on the tang screw, which I think is nice to see. It's nice to see some wear on these original pieces. As we come forward at the breech area of our barrel, we have some simple scroll engraving coming off of our top barrel flat, and there are some engraved leaves and scrolls coming off on either flat that we can see. On our side plate side of the barrel, we have our 3 maker's stamps or our proof marks. Flip it around here to the side plate side so you can check this out. Now, because we have our bayonet on the underside where we would typically see our ramrod, and like other military arms for the period where we have bayonets or bayonet attachment points, we've moved the ramrod and the ramrod channel to the side plate side of our stock. It still makes it useful because you still need these to load the muzzleloader. Our ramrod has a horn or a bone tipped end. We have 1 ramrod pipe and our entry pipe back here at the stock. These are filed with some shape like many of our original brass hardware pieces. The brass hardware on this piece is very thin. The sheet brass that is formed here is just almost scarily thin compared to what we and what many of us use today. Back here, entry pipe also has some filed ornate pieces here, again on par with what we see on a lot of English arms, especially English military arms for the time period. Back here behind our entry pipe, we have something that many of us have fought over the years, especially in building muzzleloaders, but we have a little bit of a breakout here on this piece. Now, looking at it, I don't think that it's original from the drilling of the ramrod channel. I imagine this piece could have been dropped at some point on campaign perhaps, and we've busted out a piece of that grain there, exposing our ramrod that you can see there, and you can see a bit of the channel. The wood does get very thin there, so I think our ramrod drill got a little bit too thin, or our carving on this side got a little bit too thin, but I am by no means experienced enough to critique the original maker of this. It's just a really wonderful and interesting piece. I just want to note that because, again, it's another sign of use, a sign of wear on one of the original pieces here that just adds some interesting story or concepts to your brain as you're looking at it. We have a single lock bolt here kind of denoting a bit of a later, in my mind, for the Flintlock period design here. The brass escutcheon around the screw is engraved, again, in kind of a floral pattern, matching the shape of the escutcheon, but our lock bolt going through the stock here is left plain. Then coming back to the rest of the buttstock here, you can see it's just left plain once again, like many of the British military arms. This was built and designed to be a utilitarian piece. We have the addition of the engraving and some of the marks, and again, the development of the automatic priming pan and the spring-loaded bayonet that add a little bit of a quality or allure or class, I should say, to the piece. But I should say the class is left to be in the hardware and not in the stock itself. Back here on the toe, it looks like we have an applied patch here. It's a little difficult to see, and again, not knocking the creators or the owners of this piece by any means. I just note this because of the probable use that this piece has gone through over the years. It's a really well done patch and cleans things up very well, but you kind of notice that the wear is different from the rest of the stock, but it looks to be a fairly old repair there on the toe. All in all, a really interesting piece, and I hope that you've enjoyed taking a look at it. I love, I love the standard muzzleloaders that we all know and love, but when we get an opportunity to see kind of the iterative advances that didn't really make it through, didn't really get popularized, I think it's neat to take a look at them, analyze them a little bit, and show you a little bit more. If you'd like to see some up-close photographs of this piece, if the video didn't do it justice for you, I'll have some more photos with measurements with my handy ruler here at ilovemuzzleloading.com. Feel free to search for the name of the blunderbuss as titled in this video, and you should be able to find it with those measurements, or I'll have it as the first link in the description down below. I'd like to thank the Rock Island Auction Company and their team of describers for all of their assistance and their permission to allow me to come out here, photograph and film and tell you about this wonderful muzzleloader here. So thank you very much, Rock Island Auction Company. If you'd like to see some more high quality photos and videos of the muzzleloaders that we're taking a look at this week, you can see them at the Rock Island Auction Company social media pages. I'm Ethan. I love muzzleloading. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.